Layla's footsteps echoed through the empty hall, accompanied only by the faint whisper of wind slipping through a slightly open door. The room was still cloaked in darkness, but she knew every inch of that marble floor. There was something comforting about the silence before a performance, a brief calm before she had to meet the expectations of an audience that knew nothing about her. But tonight, that calm was replaced by a gnawing feeling. She was being watched. Something or someone was different. Amir Al-Hadi sat in the shadows at one of the far tables, his gaze steady and unreadable. As the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire in the Middle East, Amir wasn't used to blending in. Yet here, in this unfamiliar city, he wanted to disappear. Since the loss of his mother, loneliness had become his constant companion, a hollow ache that wealth and power had never been able to fill. Officially, he was in the US for business, but deep down he knew he was running from the suffocating expectations that came with his name. Layla didn't need to see Amir to sense his presence. Years of performing had taught her to recognize when someone was watching her with hidden intent. Being a dancer made her a target for many stares, some filled with desire, others laced with judgment. But this was different. This gaze didn't carry lust or arrogance. There was something darker, heavier, almost haunting about it. No matter how much she tried to shake it off, her instincts whispered that this man was not just another spectator. The performance played out as usual, but Layla found herself more tense than normal. Every movement felt heavier, her breath shorter, as if invisible strings were pulling at her. By the time the show ended and the lights dimmed, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. Then, a waiter approached her quietly, handing her a folded note. "I would like to meet with you privately. Just to talk." "Amir?" Layla sighed. She had seen notes like this before, and her answer was almost always the same: no. It didn't matter how polite the wording was or how wealthy the sender appeared to be. Those meetings rarely led to anything good. Yet for some reason she couldn't crumple this one up. Something about that name echoed in her mind, as if it were a key poised to unlock a door that should have remained shut. The private lounge felt stifling despite the soft lighting and muffled music in the background. Amir stood waiting, a drink untouched at his side. When she entered, he seemed momentarily lost, searching for the right words. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he began quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I just needed to talk to someone." Layla crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Someone? Why me?" For a moment, Amir hesitated, his gaze darkening as though haunted by distant memories. "Because you're the only person here who doesn't seem to be pretending." His words hung heavily in the air, unexpected and strangely disarming. Layla wasn't sure what to make of him. She could feel that something inside him was broken, an invisible crack he struggled to hide. But she also knew that everyone had their own masks. What she couldn't yet grasp was that this seemingly insignificant meeting would set off a chain of events neither of them could control. Buried truths were about to rise to the surface, and neither of them would emerge unscathed. Layla leaned back in the velvet chair, her gaze locked on Amir. He seemed distant, as if wrestling with thoughts too heavy to voice. His shoulders were rigid, his eyes dark with a sadness that contradicted the image of control and power he projected. She could sense the tension in him, an invisible pressure threatening to crack his composed exterior. She knew that weight well. It was the same burden she carried every day, the burden of silence and secrets. "I didn't come here to bother you," Amir began, his voice low and measured. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his next words. "I just needed to escape for a while. Everything around me is fake. Meetings, social gatherings, even conversations with family. Everyone wants something. They don't care who I really am. I thought maybe you'd understand what it's like to feel trapped." Layla's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this story before, from wealthy men who thought they could buy sympathy with a few words. But Amir's voice lacked the arrogance and self-pity she had come to expect. Instead, there was a quiet, almost resigned honesty in his tone. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. Trust had never come easily to her. "Trapped?" she echoed, her voice edged with skepticism. "You're a billionaire. You could walk away from everything and live wherever you want. You have freedom most people could only dream of." Amir let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Freedom? That's an illusion," he replied, shaking his head. "I'm surrounded by people who think they own me. Expectations, obligations. No matter where I go, they follow. You can't run from the chains you carry in your mind." He tapped his temple lightly, his expression darkening. The words hung between them, weighted by an unspoken truth neither dared fully acknowledge. Layla remained silent for a moment. She recognized that pain, Different circumstances perhaps, but the same sense of being trapped in a life not fully her own. For years she had fought to control her own destiny, to escape the expectations others placed on her. Now, sitting across from Amir, she felt an uncomfortable pull of empathy. Whatever path had brought him here tonight, it seemed to mirror her own in ways she wasn't prepared to confront. And in that moment, a fragile connection was formed, one that neither of them could yet comprehend, but that would soon unearth truths capable of shaking both their worlds. Amir leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as if the weight of his words was too much to carry upright. For a moment, the only sound in the lounge was the low hum of distant music. His mind drifted to memories he had tried to bury, his mother's face, pale and fragile on her last day, whispering words he hadn't understood at the time. Words about sacrifices, obligations, and the need to protect the family name. He had spent years living under those shadows, trying to become the man she expected. But in doing so he had lost sight of who he really was. "You talk about freedom like it's easy to grasp," Amir murmured, breaking the silence. "But when you grow up under a legacy that controls every part of your life, it's not so simple. My choices were made for me before I even had the chance to dream of something else." Layla's expression softened despite herself. She had always resented the wealthy for their privilege, believing they lived without the struggles faced by people like her. Yet, in Amir's voice she heard something unsettlingly familiar, a story of expectations and lost dreams that mirrored her own. Memories of her father flashed through her mind, a man who had once been full of life but was slowly crushed by the weight of financial burdens. After his sudden death, her world had spiraled, forcing her into a life she hadn't chosen. "I get it," Layla finally said, her voice softer now. "Maybe not in the same way, but I know what it's like to feel like your life isn't really yours. After my dad died, I didn't have many choices either. Every step forward has been about survival, not freedom." Amir lifted his gaze to meet hers, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to open up, to share something so personal. In that brief exchange, he realized how much pain she had endured, and that pain wasn't so different from his own. They were two people shaped by circumstances they couldn't control, each searching for a way out of the invisible prisons they carried. Before either of them could say more, the door to the lounge opened slightly, and a man poked his head inside. It was one of Amir's assistants, looking anxious. "Mr. Al-Hadi, your next appointment is waiting," he announced apologetically. Amir sighed, frustration flickering across his face. For a moment, he debated dismissing the man entirely, but responsibility pulled at him like a chain. He stood slowly and glanced at Layla. "This isn't goodbye," he said quietly. I want to see you again." There was a vulnerability in his voice that caught Layla off guard. She nodded, unsure of what to say but strangely unwilling to let the moment end. As Amir left the room, she sat in the silence he had left behind, a strange mix of curiosity and unease churning in her chest. Deep down, she knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. But what she didn't know was how much those future encounters would change both of their lives forever. The next evening, Layla stood backstage, adjusting the thin straps of her dress and staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her mind replayed the conversation with Amir like a loop she couldn't escape. She told herself it was just another encounter with a wealthy man searching for temporary distraction, yet something in her gut said otherwise. His words about feeling trapped had struck a chord that wouldn't stop resonating. As the show began, the usual rhythm of her performance felt off. Layla's movements were automatic, but her mind drifted elsewhere. When the curtain finally dropped and the applause faded, a club manager approached her with a message. "You've got a visitor," he said with a smirk, clearly assuming what kind of request it was. Layla braced herself, expecting another entitled client, but her heart skipped slightly when she heard the name, Amir. This time, Amir wasn't waiting in the shadows. He stood near the bar, looking out of place among the loud music and flashing lights. His expression softened when he saw her, but there was an urgency in his posture. As Layla approached, he leaned in close enough for his voice to rise above the noise without shouting. "I need to speak with you, privately," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. Layla raised an eyebrow, her skepticism returning. This sudden urgency felt different from the calm vulnerability of the night before. Still, curiosity pushed her to nod, and soon they found themselves in a quieter corner of the club, away from prying eyes. "You said you wanted to see me again," Layla began, crossing her arms. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Amir hesitated before speaking, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say, People in my life aren't happy with me taking time off like this. My decisions are being questioned, and it could get complicated if the wrong person finds out I'm here. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched on his face. But that's not why I came. I wanted to offer you something, a way out if you want it. Layla blinked, taken aback. A way out? Of what? Of this? Amir gestured around the club. Whatever it is you're trying to escape from. I have the resources to help you start over if you want. His voice was earnest, but Layla recoiled slightly, suspicion flaring again. She had worked hard to maintain her independence, even when it seemed impossible. The idea of someone swooping in to save her felt insulting, even if Amir's intentions seemed genuine. I don't need saving, she said firmly. If that's what you're offering, you can stop right there. Amir sighed deeply. That's not what I meant. I see something in you. Something that reminds me of myself. I know how hard it is to carry everything on your own. Maybe I can help lighten that load. Layla was quiet for a long moment, the tension thick between them. There was truth in his words, and she hated how much they resonated. But something else lingered beneath the surface. An unspoken danger, a warning that whatever connection they were forming could come with consequences neither of them fully understood. Layla's mind raced as she walked home that night. Amir's offer had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. A way out. She had dreamed of that for years, but not like this, not by accepting help from a man she barely knew. Yet, there was a sincerity in his eyes that haunted her. He wasn't like the others she had encountered in the club. He wasn't there for amusement or control. Still, why would a man like him risk his reputation to help someone like her? What was he hiding? As she unlocked the door to her modest apartment, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was an unfamiliar number, but something told her to answer. Layla? Amir's voice was quiet, but there was a tension in it that put her on edge. I didn't want to disturb you, but I need to ask. Did anyone approach you after I left tonight? No, she replied, confusion flickering across her face. Why would someone? Just listen, Amir interrupted. Things in my world, they're not as simple as they look. There are people who don't want me stepping out of line. If they think you're connected to me in any way, they might try to intimidate you. Layla's stomach tightened. The weight in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't paranoia, this was fear. Are you serious right now? You think someone's going to come after me just because we talked? I wish I was wrong, Amir admitted. But I've seen what they're capable of. My family has eyes everywhere. They expect me to follow a certain path, and anyone who becomes important to me is seen as a threat to their control. He sighed heavily. Just be careful, okay? If anything feels off, call me. Layla hung up and stared at the phone in her hand. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the gravity of his words. She had spent her entire life fighting for survival, but this felt different. She wasn't used to being a pawn in someone else's game. Amir's world was full of invisible dangers, and now, without meaning to, she had been pulled into it. She peered out her window, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement below. For the first time in years, she felt the unsettling presence of eyes she couldn't see. The next day, Layla's anxiety only deepened. A black SUV was parked across from the club entrance, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. As she walked toward the entrance, her heart thudded in her chest. Was it paranoia, or was someone really watching her? She shook off the fear, forcing herself to act normal. She couldn't afford to lose her composure, not in front of the others. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The next evening, Layla stepped into the club with her senses heightened, every shadow and whisper seeming more ominous than before. The black SUV was still parked across the street, its presence like a silent threat. She kept her head high, refusing to show fear, but her nerves were raw. She scanned the room as she entered, half expecting someone to approach her. Nothing happened, at least not yet. The performance went by in a haze. Layla's movements were mechanical, her mind consumed by the feeling of being watched. As the final act ended, she slipped backstage, hoping for a moment to collect herself. But when she rounded the corner to her dressing room, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stood waiting. His face was impassive, but there was a coldness in his eyes that froze her in place. "Layla, right?" he said, his voice deep and unsettlingly calm. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace, though the menace in his stance was unmistakable. "Don't be alarmed. I'm just here to deliver a message." "A message?" Layla crossed her arms, masking her fear with defiance. "From who?" "Let's just say, from people who care about Mr. Al-Hadi's best interests," the man replied smoothly. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. You seem like a smart woman, so I'll keep this simple. Whatever relationship you think you have with him, it ends here. Amir has responsibilities, ones that don't include getting distracted by someone like you. Layla's jaw clenched, anger simmering beneath her fear. Distracted? I don't know what you think is going on, but Amir isn't your property. And I sure as hell don't take orders from you. The man's smile was cold and condescending. You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery won't get you far in this world. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Walk away before you become a problem. You won't like what happens if you don't. Layla didn't flinch. She held his gaze, refusing to show weakness. Are we done here? She asked, her tone sharp and unyielding. The man stared at her for a long moment before stepping back with a smirk. For now, he said, turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. Layla waited until she heard the door click shut before letting out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling, but she clenched them into fists, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew Amir's world was dangerous, but now it had become her reality. She couldn't ignore the warning, but she also couldn't let fear dictate her next move. This wasn't just about Amir anymore. It was about standing her ground and refusing to be controlled by anyone, no matter how powerful. Still, the threat lingered in the back of her mind, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She would have to be smart, and above all, she would have to be ready for whatever came next. The tension followed Layla like a storm cloud as she walked home that night. Every sound, a passing car, a rustling in the alley, set her nerves on edge. She had faced threats before, but this was different. These people weren't street-level troublemakers. They were powerful, calculating, and willing to destroy anyone who defied them. Despite her fear, she couldn't shake the anger burning inside her. How dare they treat her like she was disposable? The moment she entered her apartment, she locked the door and drew the curtains, her pulse racing. Her phone buzzed and she grabbed it instinctively. It was Amir. For a moment, she debated ignoring the call, but she needed answers. She hit the answer button. Layla? Are you okay? Amir's voice was tense, as though he already knew something had happened. I had a little visitor, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Someone who thought he could scare me into cutting ties with you. Care to explain who your friends are? Amir sighed heavily on the other end. I was afraid of this. My father's advisors are protective of the family's reputation and legacy. They monitor everything I do. If they think I'm getting close to someone who could be a distraction, they act without warning. I had no idea they'd come after you so quickly. Layla's grip tightened on the phone. They didn't come after me, Amir, they threatened me. Your world is dangerous and now I'm caught in the middle of it. I need to know the truth. Why are they so desperate to control you? Amir hesitated, and Layla could hear the conflict in his silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw. It's not just about control. It's about power, inheritance, and preserving the family's influence. They don't trust anyone outside the circle. They see you as a threat, Layla, because being with you means I'm defying them. It's not just my freedom at stake. They're willing to hurt anyone who gets in their way. Layla closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. The weight of his words pressed down on her. She wasn't naive, she understood power and control all too well. But this was bigger than anything she had ever faced. So what now? She asked quietly. I'll handle it, Amir said firmly. They won't touch you again. I promise. Layla's heart twisted at the sincerity in his voice, but she knew promises like that often came with a price. You better, she whispered. Because if they try anything else, I'm not going to sit quietly and wait. As the call ended, Layla paced the room, her mind racing. She had a choice to make: walk away now and leave Amir to deal with his family's war alone, or stand her ground and risk everything. Either way, there was no turning back. Whatever path she chose, the stakes had just been raised, and the shadows surrounding them were closing in fast. Amir stared out the window of his penthouse suite, the city lights stretching endlessly beneath him. He could feel the walls closing in just like they always did when his family interfered. The call from Layla weighed heavily on his mind. He had never wanted her to become a target, yet his world was ruthless, loyalty and control meant everything. His father's advisors, men hardened by decades of protecting the family's power, wouldn't back down easily. They saw Layla as a threat, and threats had a way of disappearing. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Rafiq, his father's most trusted lieutenant. The man entered without waiting for an invitation, his sharp eyes scanning the room before fixing on Amir. We need to talk, Rafiq said, his voice cold and direct. He walked over to a chair, sitting as though he owned the place. I warned you that your behavior was becoming a problem. You've ignored those warnings? Amir crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. If you're here to deliver another lecture about family duty, save your breath. I've heard it all before. This isn't a lecture, Rafiq replied, leaning forward. It's an ultimatum. You need to end whatever this is with the girl. She's not part of our world and she never will be. If you don't walk away now, there will be consequences. For both of you. Amir's eyes narrowed, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. You think you can threaten me? Layla has nothing to do with our family's business. Leave her alone. Rafiq chuckled darkly. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about her. It's about control. Your father built this empire on loyalty and discipline. If you defy us, you're showing weakness, and weakness invites enemies. We can't afford that. He stood, his posture intimidating. This is your last chance, Amir. Walk away from her, or I can't guarantee her safety. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Amir's neck. His fists clenched, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't allow them to hurt Layla, but walking away from her now felt like a betrayal, of her and of himself. For the first time he faced a crossroads that threatened to tear him apart. Later that night, Amir found himself sitting in his car outside Layla's apartment. He hadn't told her he was coming, unsure of what he would even say. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him like lead. How could he protect her without pushing her away? His thoughts were interrupted when the front door opened and Layla stepped outside, her eyes meeting his through the windshield. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him. You weren't going to tell me you were here, were you? She asked, folding her arms as she stood by his window. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, as if she could sense the storm brewing inside him. I didn't want to drag you into this, Amir admitted. But it's too late now. Layla exhaled slowly. Amir, I'm already in this. You said you'd protect me, but I need to know the truth. What are we really up against? Amir opened the car door and stepped out, standing face to face with her. It's worse than I thought, he confessed. They gave me an ultimatum. Leave you or face the consequences. His voice broke slightly as he added, They're not bluffing, Layla. They'll come after you if I don't comply. Layla's eyes hardened. Then we fight, she said quietly but with determination. I've been through hell before, Amir. I'm not going to let them scare me into submission. If they want to fight, they've got one. Amir reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. You don't know what you're saying. These people don't play by any rules. Neither do I when it comes to survival, Layla shot back. We do this together or not at all. For a moment, Amir just stared at her, overwhelmed by a mixture of admiration and fear. He knew what they were stepping into, and how high the cost might be. But in that moment he made his decision. They wouldn't back down. Not this time. The following days unfolded like a tense game of chess. Layla kept a low profile, but the pressure was palpable. The black SUV had reappeared near the club, parked at different corners each night. The message was clear, she was being watched. At first, she tried to act as if everything was normal, but the fear crept into her mind, making her hyper-aware of every movement, every glance from strangers. She could almost feel the invisible strings tightening around her life. Amir wasn't faring much better. His meetings were filled with veiled threats and subtle reminders of his duty. Rafiq made it clear that time was running out. Each conversation ended with ominous warnings about what would happen if Amir continued to defy his family. But despite the pressure, Amir's resolve only hardened. He would not sacrifice Layla for their control. He began putting plans in place, discreetly transferring money, securing alternate arrangements, but he knew they were watching his every move. One night, as Layla left the club, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't Rafiq or one of his men, but someone else, a stranger with cold eyes and a predatory air. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said, his voice low and threatening. People like you don't last long in our world. Walk away now while you still can. Layla's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wasting your time, she said, her voice steady. Tell whoever sent you that I'm not going anywhere. The man smirked but didn't press further. He simply stepped back into the darkness, leaving her shaken but defiant. Later that night, Amir showed up at her apartment, visibly tense. They're escalating, he said without preamble. I got word that they brought in someone dangerous. A fixer. He's the kind of person they call when intimidation doesn't work. Let them come, Layla replied, her eyes blazing with determination. I'm not running from them, Amir. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. Amir grabbed her shoulders gently, looking into her eyes with a mix of desperation and fear. You don't understand. These people play dirty. They'll go after anyone you care about, any weakness they can exploit. I can't let you get hurt because of me. You're not the only one who's been fighting to survive, Layla said softly. I've faced worse than this, Amir. But if we don't stand our ground now, they'll own us forever. We have to push back, together. Amir's jaw tightened. He knew she was right, but the stakes had never felt so high. The path ahead was dangerous, and the margin for error was razor thin. Time was running out, and both of them knew that the next move could decide everything. The night was unusually quiet, an unsettling calm that stretched across the city like a warning. Layla paced in her apartment, her fists clenching and unclenching as she waited. Amir had told her to stay inside tonight. He was meeting with Rafiq and the rest of his father's advisors, intending to put an end to the threats once and for all. But Layla knew how dangerous that meeting would be. The stakes had reached their peak, and if Amir failed, there would be no turning back. Meanwhile, Amir stood in the middle of a vast, dimly lit conference room, surrounded by his family's most powerful enforcers. Rafiq sat at the head of the long table, his expression cold and calculating. "You've pushed us too far, Amir," he said in a low voice. "You had every opportunity to correct your course, but instead you chose defiance. Now you leave us no choice." "You don't scare me, Rafiq," Amir shot back, his voice firm. "I've spent my entire life living under your rules, suffocating under your control. But that ends tonight. I'm not going to sacrifice my happiness or Layla's life to protect your empire." A murmur spread through the room, some of the advisors exchanging glances. Amir took a step forward. "You think fear keeps you in power, but I've learned something you haven't. Control through fear is fragile. The moment someone stands up to you, your power cracks." He paused, locking eyes with Rafiq. "I'm standing up to you now." For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick with tension. Then unexpectedly, Rafiq let out a dry chuckle. "You've grown, Amir. I'll give you that. But you're still naive. You think this is about power alone? It's about survival. Our enemies are always watching, always waiting for weakness. You can walk out of here with your defiance, but don't think they won't notice. And don't think they won't come for you, and for her." Amir didn't flinch. "Let them come. I'm done living in fear." He turned on his heel and walked out, his heart pounding. The confrontation hadn't ended the way he expected. Rafiq hadn't issued a final threat or called his men to stop him. That was more unnerving than anything. He knew they weren't finished, but he had made his stand. Now the real test would come in the days ahead. Back at Layla's apartment, Amir arrived just before midnight. Layla rushed to him, her relief palpable. "What happened?" she asked urgently. "I confronted them. They backed down, for now," Amir said, his voice weary. He took her hand and guided her to the couch. "But this isn't over. They'll watch us, waiting for a chance to strike again. We need to be ready for anything." Layla squeezed his hand tightly. "We will be together." The two sat in silence, a shared understanding settling between them. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Their future was uncertain, shadowed by the enemies who still lurked in the background. But they had reclaimed their agency, their right to live on their own terms. For the first time in years, they felt a glimmer of hope. Outside, the streets remained eerily quiet, but neither of them feared the shadows anymore. They had faced the darkness and refused to be broken. Whatever came next, they would face it together, stronger than before.